Welcome and thank you for joining us. You're listening to the Beyond 50 radio program. I'm Daniel Davis, your host. With us today on the program is someone who's going to talk about a timely subject that I think most of us would rather just not think about. And it's true that a lot of times people actually go through their lives with fear, but that number one fear usually relates directly to death. The fear of dying, because we really don't know what happens once we're finished with this life. There are many poets out there that seem to shed some light and ideas of what death is and the experience. Sages who like to share insights of how they've meditated on death and be able to share to the world that the other side probably isn't as scary as we think it is. And there are also sums of religions that make us promises about once we're done here, what happens there. Joining us here on the Beyond 50 radio program today is a licensed acupuncturist and shiatsu practitioner who practices and lives in both Oregon and Hawaii. And he's joining us today to help talk about and perhaps meditate on the subject of what happens after life, which is death. With us here on the Beyond 50 radio program is our guest, Bart Walton. And Bart, thank you for joining us here on the Beyond 50 radio program today.
Yeah, you're very welcome. I'm glad to be here.
Now, it's interesting because this is something that you, self-proclaimed, have been thinking about since you were very, very young. What kind of made you move in that direction?
Well, I don't know. I just, when I was very young, I was very interested in death. To me, it seemed obvious. It's an obvious question. It's like a journey or some kind of an experience that we're all going to make in our lives. And how can we not be curious? I remember my first real experience about thinking about death, I was probably about 6 years old, and suddenly it just kind of hit me, that it's certain that at some point in my life, sooner or later, I'm going to die. And the profundity of that certainty just sunk very deeply in me. And at first it created fear. And then later in life, as I continued to question it, it was more of a curiosity. And then later it became almost like a mission in my life. But I think it's something that everybody, when I was young, I felt that it was something that surely everybody else is interested in too. So I would often question people about it and talk to people about it. And as I went on, I found that, most people are not interested in this. And in fact, most people don't want to talk about it. And so I guess I've realized that this is kind of an unusual topic, and I don't really push my thoughts on people, but there are some people who do want to talk about it, and part of my mission is to sort of raise people's awareness about death and dying and to create an open forum.
Well, it's certain that death is certainly something that we all inevitably do alone, and so you can see how this could be kind of one of those subjects. Well, let me just kind of think about what I'm doing right now, and we'll think about that when the time comes. But
right.
This is sort of a mission that you created in your own work, and so was your hope in this mission to get people to really start talking about it and being introspective or, giving insights as to maybe some answers they may have come up with?
Well, I would say, in a nutshell, my mission is to first of all serve people who are dying and who would like to have, would like to talk, would like to understand what's happening to them, or their loved ones who would like to know how they can serve the dying. Secondly, I would say my mission is to help heal our collective fear and denial about death and dying, and to raise awareness about death in terms of its role in cosmic evolution. So there's no question in my mind that our collective fear about death and dying is something that has a profound impact on our minds and really is at the root of a lot of our negative behavior patterns, both as individuals and as a society. But also, I think a lot of people have questions about death and dying, not many. But I think often, even if people haven't thought about it or been willing to look at it during the course of their lifetime, as they get closer to it, or as maybe an illness comes or something like that, or maybe a loved one dies, then suddenly they do want to talk about it and they do want to find out more about it. And so I just want to be available to people on that basis when and if they're ready to talk about it and to inquire into it.
Now, since this is something that you have been interested in understanding since you were very young, what are some of the lessons, if you will, that you've learned along the way?
In terms of what happens after death?
Sure.
Well, I've had the good fortune of spending time. Well, first of all, I got into Plato when I was in college, and studying the writings of Plato and Socrates. That really inspired me to inquire deeply into the subject of death. And also, I had the good fortune of spending time with Maharishi Mahesh Yogi and with Barry Long, who are two spiritual teachers who spoke very openly about death and dying and shared their insights, which I've found really helpful to me in understanding it. And the other thing I've done in the course of my life is I've looked at all the scriptures of the world and what they say about death and dying, and tried to find the common elements or the common threads that sort of piece these scriptures together. In other words, instead of looking at the differences, looking at how maybe from the different times these scriptures were written in the different languages, how maybe there's some commonality in them. And I found that there's a tremendous amount of commonality there. And putting all these things together, the things that I was taught by my spiritual teachers, the scriptures that are of the world religions, and then my own insights, my own meditations and experiences, I have come up with what I think, and I'm fairly certain, is a very common thread that runs through the human psyche in terms of death and dying. So in terms of what happens after death, I mean, would you like me just to kind of talk about that a little bit?
Absolutely, because I was just starting to think of Joseph Campbell, which, he writes about the power of myth and that the human story seems to have, common things no matter what language or what area the story comes from, about the hero, the quest, the journey, and then all the rights and trials and errors they got to deal with. And here we finally get an opportunity to have sort of a Joseph Campbell on dying, which is quite interesting, actually.
Well, you're exactly right, because if you look at the various myths about death or the scriptures, there are some very common perspectives that repeat themselves over and over again. And you could call these things myths, if you will. But myths are really a way that our own collective psyche or unconscious speaks to us. So, I think the simplest way, I definitely don't want to talk too much about this because I would like the listeners to go to my website and read for themselves, because it takes more than just a few minutes to kind of cover a lot of these things. But in a nutshell, let's consider life a process where consciousness expands outward into the world. So death then is just a reversal of this process where consciousness goes back inward into its source. In other words, it's the natural movement of consciousness from more of the relative aspect of life to the deeper absolute aspects of life, and then back out again. So it's like breathing. It's like consciousness breathes out and then breathes in. And this alternating back and forth is really what the Buddhists refer to as the wheel of birth and death. And it's really a fascinating process, but it's an impersonal process. It's the impersonal laws of nature, which we experience in a very personal and intimate way as our own lives and as our death. So anyway, I think one of the things I try to point out in the website is that just as life has very recognizable stages, life is really one thing. It's one experience. It's a continuous experience that starts when we're born and ends when we die. But we refer to life as taking place in terms of stages. We say, okay, there's childhood, there's adolescence, there's adulthood and old age. And like that, the process of dying is a continuous experience, but there are certain recognizable stages that happen during this process. The first stage is what I call the cosmic panorama. And this happens after what's termed what we call death. When the breathing stops and the body is no longer a living body, it becomes a corpse. At this stage, somewhere along the line, there might be a period of unconsciousness, but it's somewhere along the line, suddenly we awaken and we find ourselves in the after-death state. And the initial feeling of this is ecstatic, because after being associated with a physical body for many years, we suddenly find that we're free and we're alive and we're without the weight and restrictions of the body. And for the first time, we know with certainty that there is no death. So we feel we've gone through kind of the worst-case scenario, and it's okay. We've survived. We're okay. So this lifts a tremendous fear from the psyche, because, we've had this kind of in the back of our mind that life, no matter how happy it is, that it has a bad ending. And all of a sudden we realize, oh, it doesn't have a bad ending after all. It's okay. So this initial stage is really a stage of tremendous happiness and beauty. The next stage that happens is called purification. And in some traditions it's called purgatory or hell, although it's important to realize it's a very temporary stage. No matter who you are, no matter what kind of life you live, it's not eternal. It's a stage that we go through. And basically, during this stage, it's the normal, natural process of the psyche throwing off or having to dissolve negative impressions that are lodged there. Because consciousness is really a form of energy. And in order for energy to move from one plane to another plane, it has to rid itself of coarser or vibrations that aren't congruent with the next stage. So things like fear, anger, greed, jealousy, hatred, these kinds of negative patterns that are lodged in the psyche, that are vibrating at a certain frequency, have to be, these vibrations are not compatible with the higher planes of existence. And as we are evolving through the process of death from the denser planes to the higher planes, these negative patterns have to be released. And the way these things are released is we review them and we experience them, and we see how the negativity we had in our lives impacted us and impacted other people. And we might feel remorse or shame even, or even stronger sensations of psychic pain. But this is a temporary stage, and once we see the big picture, we really see that this is a blessing, because it's like a psychic detox. When it's over, we experience a level of purity and freedom that we've long forgotten.
Bart, it's interesting as you bring that part up, because, and I hope I get this name right, but in Greek mythology, I think it was Heraclides who was bound to roll the big stone up the hill, and before it got to the top, it would roll back down again, and he'd just have to repeat this for eternity. And I remember when I had first heard that, I thought, oh my goodness, man, dying sounds like a bummer. Like in the Christian world, you're either going to heaven because you've accepted Christ, or you're going to eternal hell, whatever that means. It's usually fire and brimstone.
Right.
But what you're saying makes, to me, even in the Catholic religion, they talk about purgatory. It's a period of time. The Tibetans are the same way. They talk about a period of time. And so what you're saying there about purification makes a lot of sense, actually.
Well, if you think if you consider that after death, there's no longer a physical body, so all there is psychic energy that's held together by, desire, basically. Mm-hmm. And this psychic energy is ascending, if you will, from the denser planes to the subtler planes. So any kind of vibration that's not compatible with this movement has to be released.
Oh, okay.
It's a very impersonal process, but the experience of it is very personal. Mm-hmm. It's very intimate. And so we might experience it in terms of, judgment and forgiveness and things of that nature. It might be experienced in a lot of different ways. And it might be experienced as, having to roll the rock up the hill and having it come down again. but it's still temporary because at some point, the reason why we have to repeat, maybe something unpleasant again and again and again is because we haven't really processed it. We haven't really learned what's there and absorbed the lesson and let go of it.
Now, was there a stage after purification?
Yeah, the next stage is what I call extracting the essence. And this is an interesting stage because after the purification, after all the negative psychic energy's been sort of released, then what the soul, if you will, although that's a very loaded word, but if we have to call it something, the entity, has to do at this stage is to really review the life that's just lived and boil it down to its essence, the purest essence of the life just lived. This is where we review every aspect of life that we've just lived and save the most salient or meaningful value of it. It's kind of like, when miners extract gold from the earth, they might collect 50 tons of raw ore only to produce a single ounce of pure gold. And in the same way, after a living, life 50, 80, 90 years, there's a huge amount of psychic material from the past life that has to be sifted and boiled down, and it yields only a very tiny particle of divine essence. And the nature of this essence is really a mystery. It can be called truth or love or beauty. It's the purest essence of the life experience. And this is really the treasure that divine consciousness, or God, if you will, extracts through our process of living and dying on earth. And this essence, or this little particle of essence, is then added to our divine body. And that leads to sort of the next stage, which is really hard to describe. I call it the divine realm. And the divine realm is this vast and inconceivable place where our spiritual body exists. And within it are many divine worlds and many ascending levels. But basically, this represents the most real and eternal level of creation, where we reside in direct communion with divine consciousness, or God. In some traditions, this is called heaven or the celestial plane. But these concepts really don't do justice to the inconceivable love and beauty which are the essential elements of this realm. Now, the problem is that for most of us, when we get to this stage, there isn't enough, our spiritual bodies just aren't quite awake enough to remain there. In other words, our spiritual body hasn't evolved sufficiently to sustain a conscious presence in the divine realm. But it's okay, because our divine essence is never lost. It's continually added to our evolving spiritual body. And when sufficient divine essence accumulates, then we can awaken with the presence in that realm. But until then, for most people, when they get to that point, there's kind of a lapse in consciousness, and then the next thing they know, they're kind of reborn again as a human in the earth plane. And that can go on for quite some time. But it's okay, because our spiritual body is never lost. And it's actually something that we reflect off of in our lives all the time. Whenever we are doing something really courageous or selfless in the face of difficult circumstances, we're really reflecting off of that spiritual or higher self that is existing and waiting for us in the divine realm.
I'm reminded of an interesting movie called Defending Your Life, Albert Brooks movie, and he was talking with
I remember that, yeah.
So you remember, so he's up to this place, Judgment City, and they decide that, from that point, whether you've lived life in such a way that you're able to move on or that you have to go back down to earth and try it again. And I thought, this is an interesting approach to the life and death question here, and he simply asked the question, well, have I been to Earth a few times? He says, oh, yeah, lots of times. And he says, but I've known people who've been to Earth hundreds of times, although I wouldn't want to hang out with any of them. and I found that funny, but it sounds like what you're saying is that there's an element of truth in that you kind of come and you get it right so you can move on, I guess.
Well, it's kind of like we're building a spiritual body, and it takes time, and everybody has their own builds it at their own pace. But it's kind of like, when the fetus is in the womb for 9 months, it's building a body that's suitable for the world in which it's about to be born. And life on Earth is similar in that during life on Earth, we're building a body for the next existence, for the next higher level of evolution. And this process can take time, but it's, there's all the time in the world. So
now, when it comes to someone, or just people, what is the best way for a person to prepare for death? Should they just meditate on this throughout their lives? And if so, and you know someone who is dying, is there a way that we can actually be of real genuine assistance to people who are dying?
Well, preparing for death is something that we really have to do our whole lives.
Mm-hmm.
There's no easy answer to that. I think it's valuable to spend time contemplating death, to think about the time when it will come. Secondly, I think it's important to cultivate attitudes that will be helpful to free ourselves as much as possible from negative psychic energy so that we don't have to go through a long or painful psychic detox after death.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it sounds very, very cliche-ish, but really, attitudes that feel good, such as love and friendliness and service, excellence, integrity, nonviolence, these kinds of attitudes, to the degree we can cultivate these things, it will free us up a great deal. Just as I think it's important to try to resolve any anger and resentment we have while we're here so that, when we do die, we don't have these things weighing on us. So that's one important thing we can do when we to prepare for death. I think another very powerful way to prepare for death is to spend time with the dying. And, it's funny, in earlier times, people died at home, and the whole family was involved, even the children. And everybody was a witness to the process. And to witness death is a powerful lesson. If we pay attention, we can intuitively understand what's happening. When the person passes away, we can feel that something has left the body. And after a few hours, it's clear that the body is just an empty shell, like a dead tree branch.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think, spending time with the dying, being part of the dying process for other people is a very powerful way for us to understand both life and death. In terms of being assistance to the dying, I've got some things that I outline in my website, so I don't need to really, I think, go into a lot of detail here. But I think the most important thing is, particularly after people have died, is to understand that they're not dead. The body's dead, but the awareness is still very much alive and sensitive to both the things that we might say, to our thoughts and feelings. So it's important after people die to not think of them as dead, because they can pick up on this, and it might actually hold them back because they might be trying to contact you or their other loved ones to let you know that they're okay, that they're not dead. So I think it's important after people die to avoid a lot of overt grieving. I mean, some grieving is natural, but it's important to understand that the departed can hear and often see everything in the room for some time after the body's dead. So if they hear a lot of emotional upset, they might try to want to console their loved ones, and that can actually hold them back.
I was wondering, Bart, have you ever heard of the afterlife experiments?
No, I haven't.
Okay. This was an opportunity I had probably close to about 8 years ago, where I interviewed the author who put this book together, and he was actually part of a team of people that went out and brought in what were considered to be the best psychics out there, people who could truly do the work of being psychics. and they did what was called the afterlife experiments. In other words, these psychics were responsible for seeing if they can in fact communicate with people who had passed on and actually bring special messages back for specific people to see if in fact there was life after death. And it was resounding at the accuracy that these psychics had was ranging anywhere from 89 to 97% accuracy, and not only the information that they were conveying from the other side, but that it was specific to specific people. And it was one of those books that you're just fascinated. It was actually produced for HBO, if I understand, as an actual documentary. And it was amazing some of the things that were being said and produced there, that when you're saying that the people who have passed are actually seeing and aware of what you're doing and saying and being, that through these psychics they were able to communicate that. That isn't to say run out and get a psychic and say, hey, what does Joe think about me and so forth. But the point is that one of the ways that people sometimes get sort of stuck here on this plane is because the energy just holds them here? Is that a possibility of why ghosts exists, for instance, in houses or restaurants? Or what is your take on that?
That's a complicated question. And
well, I know, and I know we don't have a lot of time, but
I wish we did have a lot of time because we could talk about that, and I'd like to talk about that. But to kind of put it in a nutshell, for most people, for the vast majority of people, they don't have to worry about being trapped here or stuck here. But it can, if the departed person feels like that they have unfinished business, or feels that they are very concerned about someone behind, then that can hold them back a little bit. Probably not for very long, and I don't want people to be overly concerned about it. But it's just that to whatever degree we can free people from these feelings of obligation or feelings of having to take care of us, that's better for them.
Mm-hmm. Now, what are the main things you like people to know about death?
Well, I think the first thing is that it's safe. Even though I haven't died in this lifetime, I'm absolutely certain that this is so. It's an experience that as living beings we've been through many times. And the other thing I think it's important for people to know for sure is that sense of presence that we all have inside us, that subjective feeling of I, that is actually a light that comes from a completely different realm. And that light never goes out. There will never be a time where that I presence isn't there. Now, there might be a time where we're kind of like asleep, where we go into kind of like a semi-unconsciousness, but at various times we will awaken again, and that I presence will be there. So it's just important for people to realize that there really is no death.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting too, Bart, because I know that back in the 90s, when I was having a series of dreams, that I was dreaming that I was dying, actually, perhaps having a heart attack, whatever, and kind of screaming out for somebody to come and help me. And what was interesting, though, is one night, as I was having this dream, I thought, you know what, why not just die? And so I did that. At least I did in the dream state. What was amazing was the tremendous peace that I really felt just in the dream alone. It was like there was a knowing saying, see, this is all it is. What are you afraid of? And what's interesting about that is when you talk with people who have experienced being next to someone's bedside, when that point happens where they do die, they continuously almost all say the same thing. Don't worry about it. It's really okay.
Exactly.
Like, this is actually the best thing that's ever about to happen to me is this moment here,
Well, and, if you're feeling that peace, it means you're not dead, right?
Exactly.
So I think that's the main point, is that there's definitely a lot of changes that go on, and our body changes and drops off, but there is no real death.
Fascinating. I know that I'd like to have the opportunity to have you on again so we can explore the more complex issues that people can get tangled up with about this. But
Yeah.
what kind of service do you offer to those who are dying or to even their loved ones?
Well, I think it's important for me to say at the beginning, I'm not a licensed therapist. Uh,
Right.
I'm not a psychiatrist, and so I'm not offering any kind of therapy. But very
Mm-hmm.
simply, I'll offer a listening ear, conversation about this subject. And I feel if people can allow themselves to dip their toe into the terror of death and dying, they'll find that they can relax. And in this relaxation, then their own intuition can lead them to the truth about it. Also, I offer people advice on how they can be of service to their own loved ones. And if people who are dying want to talk about it, I'll be happy to talk with them as well.
Mm-hmm. I wonder sometimes, Bart, if it isn't so much the fear of dying that people are afraid of, but it's how they die.
Yes, yes. And, you know, as having been I used to volunteer for hospice, and I was present with my parents' death. And one thing I've really learned is that when people get close to death, it's we think of death as being very painful and unpleasant,
Sure.
but the body has a way of protecting us from this. And when we get close to death, oftentimes, usually, the person is really not suffering, even though their breathing may be labored and they may be dehydrated and not able to take food and so forth. And we think, oh, this must be terrible, but they're really not suffering that much. So somehow nature has some very protective mechanisms in place. So I think people are very afraid. It's not so much of death, but they're afraid of the unpleasantness or the pain associated with death.
Well, I'll tell you, interesting subject all the time. That's why I know that we've had the subject on our program a couple of times over the last 5 years, and it seems that it isn't something again, that people really like to talk about, and it's something that I think should be, because just as in the Japanese samurai, that is something they certainly meditate on a constant basis, is death itself, because then they are in life in the moment. And certainly you can see how that would be very liberating, so that you could really be free to enjoy your life as you're anticipating death. Kind of an interesting way to live.
Yes, exactly.
Now, Bart, why don't you go ahead and give out your website so people can explore this?
Okay. Very simply, it's www.lifebeyonddeath.org. And there's a lot of different pages there, and there's also a contact page if people want to contact me by email. There's also a telephone page if people want to contact me by phone. So I'm available, and I realize that the vast majority of people are not interested in this subject, and that's fine. But for those who are, I want to offer a conversation.
Well, you certainly have more than 50 years of being on this quest, so I'm sure that you have a lot of wonderful insights for those who are willing to pursue this particular subject that so many think that they want to avoid.
Well, it's a learning in process, so I don't consider myself at the end of the exploration by any means.
Go ahead and give your website out again one more time.
Yeah, it's www.lifebeyonddeath.org.
Very good. Well, Bart Walton, it's been a pleasure to have you on the program, and I'd like to welcome the opportunity down the road to do this again, because like you said, as we were getting into some of those other realms, those kind of get complex, and I think those would be very interesting to explore.
Yeah, I'd be happy to, Daniel. Thank you very much for having me.
Thank you very much. Bart Walton on Life Beyond Death, and thank you for joining us on the Beyond 50 radio program. We also want to thank you, the listeners out there, for joining us, tuning into the Beyond 50 radio program. Again, giving out that website. It's lifebeyonddeath.org, so certainly visit the website and, just start asking the question. Maybe even ask others who are just as curious to find out about their experience of what it means or what death is all about. Also, might want to also explore another website, which is ours, beyond50radio.com. That's the number 50 with a 50, and sign up for our free weekly e-newsletter. And also visit us at our blog as well, where we have all this information available right at your fingertips, all absolutely for free. I'm Daniel Davis. Thank you for tuning in. You've been listening to the Beyond 50 radio program. And remember, live your day past halfway.